To win just once. On TV tonight, there's a new two-part documentary series starting on RT1 just after the 9 o'clock news, and it's called The Silent Civil War, and it features never-before-heard testimonies of Civil War revolutionaries, and there's been so much written about and talked about the War of Independence and the Civil War, given that centenaries have been and are of late. And this series will feature testimonies of family members as well of a number of those who were involved in the Civil War. And there's a Donegal man on it tonight, Brian Cannon from Lechamac Ward. He's going to feature in episode 1, and he's speaking about his uncle Barney Cannon. And Brian joins us now in the studio. Thanks for coming in, Brian.
Thank you very much, John.
Right, let's go back a bit to before the Civil War and chat a bit about your uncle. Was he born into a Republican family?
No. I'll go back a little bit further. Maybe it'd be a wee bit helpful. My grandfather was one of 10 children, and they all emigrated to America. And 3 of them came back, and my grandfather was one who came back, and he took over the home place. He was a qualified shoemaker. He made ladies' and men's shoes totally, and he also repaired shoes, the usual thing. But as the years went on, the big feature was working boots, and that's the way men worked. And when he went to America, himself and his brother first, they made quite a lump of shoes and boots, and they got one of those carters who was going to Derry to take stuff back, and they loaded the cart and they went to Derry, and they sold the boots and shoes on the streets of Derry to get their fare to go to America.
Right, so an unusual way to get
that
fare.
Where was money? There was no money. Yeah. So they got their money, and he was in America for maybe 10 years, maybe more. I don't know how long he was in America. But he came back after the parents died, and back to the home place, and resumed his trade. And one day this man came into him and said to him, "Would you make me a pair of boots?" Because he said, "I'm going to ask this girl over the road to marry me." And in those days, if you had a good pair of boots on you,
it helped.
It helped a long way. So my grandfather never made the man the boots, but went over himself and asked the girl to marry him.
Good one.
If that was political, I don't know.
No, it doesn't sound very political, no.
No, and that was the start of it. And he married my grandmother, who was known as locally as Mary Ward. She was Campbell from a townland called Bayurther. She was a school assistant in those days. It was called Jam, or whatever it's called, had a name on them. Assistant teacher, and she taught in the school, and then she married my grandfather, and they went on to have 11 children.
Right, big family.
And she had 4 boys and 7 girls, and Barney and Colum were twins. So they were about the 4th born, and they were born in 98.
Right.
1898. 1898 were born, and they went to school, and they were identical, and they were 2 devils, and did all sorts of things. And then in my father was very anti-British now at that stage, and I think everybody was really, I suppose, at that time. But anyway, along came the Lettermich Ward Post Office became vacant, and they applied for it. And they got it under, and that was under British rule at the time. Yeah. So his appointment came from the Secretary General of the Post Office in Britain. And the letter is still in the house. And time then came when Colum and Barney was 13 or 14, and they decided to send Colum to St Eunan's College, Letterkenny, and keep Barney at home. And that's the way things were done in those days. And Colum, on his first year, having done the first year, came home during the summer holidays, and himself and Barney were into football, and after a match they went for a swim in the Gibara River. Colum was a good swimmer, and he dived off a rock into this pool, and he swam a bit, and then he stood in the water and was caught in quicksand.
Oh God.
Badly caught, and couldn't be released. And he lost his life. Barney was with him. Did everything, tried to pull him in. In those days the football boots were made, the laces were made of leather. He tied them together, and he wasn't able to, they broke, he wasn't able to pull them in. He did everything, so he stayed with him till he was gone. And then he built a cairn of stones to mark the spot where Barney went down.
Tragic.
And it's a side story. When that happened, my grandmother was with her daughters at the lake down from the house, and they used to go there on a lovely Sunday evening and sit, and this was in August. And when they're sitting there, the sky got very dark, and there came an opening in the sky, like a beautiful light opening, and this beautiful light went up through the sky right up into the opening, and then it brightened up again, and somebody said to them, "Mama, what's that?" "Oh, she, that is a soul going to heaven." And then sometime later they heard the thing in Barney, Colin was drowned. Then further on, Colin then was sent to Letterkenny College in place, Barney was sent to college, and people know him as
in place of Colin.
In place of Colin then. He's like, people refer to him as Bernard as well, but he's locally was known as Barney, and he was there, and I think maybe after a year or two he was expelled for smoking, sadly, and he went off to Scotland then to try and he worked on tugboats for a while, and then conscription happened in England, and he came back, and he joined the local brigades that were being formed at the time, and they were just sweeping around. And then when the official army was for the War of Independence, he joined up that, and he was he came up the ranks. He was appointed, and eventually, after the war, after the signing of the treaty, the Civil War broke out, and Barney took the side of the National Army, and a lot of his friends went the opposite way, so it was difficult. And he was posted around, and eventually he was sent to Creeslough. And while in Creeslough, he was promoted to captain, and so
he was a captain in the Free State Army.
Yeah, captain of the Free State Army, and he was almost 24, and he had applied to join the newly formed Guard, the Síochána, and he was being accepted into the Guard, the Síochána, at the rank of inspector.
Wow.
And he was due to be relieved of his command on the Monday morning, and on the previous Saturday night he was shot dead.
By anti-treaty forces?
By anti-treaty, but I don't think they were regular. I don't think they were kind of a put together band themselves that thought they were. I personally think they had something against Barney or something. They must have known he was going away, and they wanted to maybe give him a good fright or something. But what they did, they attacked the barracks at 11 o'clock, and in those days, you'd nearly know if you're in a town what room everybody slept in with the lights on and off and little things like that. And I think they started shooting in the barracks. And opposite the barracks was a forge and a pub, but at the forge was a wall. And I think the shooter stood on the wall, and when Barney was coming down the stairs, maybe carrying a light, the glass above the door, Barney was shot through the glass. Now, people said he was shot, he opened the door. Barney was a very experienced soldier. He wasn't foolish. He had been through a lot of things with the Black and Tans.
Known better than those.
He did. The Black and Tans give Barney's family an awful lot of hassle and grief, and they were looking for Barney, and they even arrested my grandfather and threw him into jail in Derry at 70 years of age in his night clothes to try and get Barney. So that myth that he was shot through the door, they opened the door, they was foolish, and he heard that is not true. And I went to the trouble of going down to Creeslough, and I talked to several people in Creeslough at the time, and they always referred to him as the young man that was shot coming down the stairs.
Yeah.
But so did Joseph Sweeney, who was OC for Donegal at the time. When he came back to look at the shooting and what happened, he discovered the bullets behind the wall and thing, and he came to the conclusion that he was shot coming down the stairs, because they wouldn't have shot through the door in case they'd shoot some of the. Most of the people in the barracks were local people from Creeslough. So I my personal opinion is that.
So you think it was an attack on the barracks, but they didn't deliberately target Barney, but they were just shooting?
I think they must have known where he was coming down the stairs with the light. That is my opinion. My grandfather and grandmother came down, and the saddest part of that is the other thing. A little information was that. We had the post office. My grandmother was in the post office at the time, and on the Sunday morning, she got the telegram, and it was dot dash and code, and she was writing it out, and there it was: Captain Bernard Cannon shot in Creeslough Barracks on Saturday night. Her own son.
Because she was in the post office.
She was in the post office, and all the family were at mass. So she had to get a Protestant neighbour to go over to the chapel to deliver the information, and it was terrible. My grandfather and his daughters were at Mass, and my father, a young fella. So it was a terrible time. The shooting also brought on the shooting of the 4 men in Drumbo, 3 from Kerry and 1 from Derry, and these men had nothing at all to do with Barney's shooting, but they were shot in reprisal for his shooting. They were already captured, and they were already court-martialed for carrying arms, and there were a lot of people wrote, including one of the men whose uncle was a bishop in Kerry at the time. One of the people from a lady from Creasle, I think it was, or Kilcara, wrote asking the bishop could do something to try and get these men off this charge in case. But anyway, with the shooting of Barney, they hastened it, and the word came down from Dublin that these 4 men were to be shot. And in as far as I understand, in those type of shooting, those reprisals, there was supposed to be 1 person from every province. That's the way they were supposed to be taken. But there was 3 taken from Kerry, because there was a lot of tragedies in Kerry. There were a lot of terrible happenings in Kerry at the time. The Ballyseedy and all these 4 fellows were blown up and whatnot by the National Army. So I think they took their judgment was poor, and what they did was kind of vengeful. My grandmother and my grandfather, they did everything in their power to have this shooting stopped. They knew what was to lose not 1 son but 2 sons, and there was nothing in it for anybody, but the shooting went ahead and they lost their lives, those men. They were very brave men, actually. They seemed to believe in what they were doing, even though it was the end of the line for them. I'm always amazed at their courage, but they had an option. All they had to do was lay down their arms and they could go free. My uncle had no option. He was shot dead. He was murdered, really. Yeah. And I'm very grateful. One of the people that was very helpful to me in doing research was the late Father John Silk from Creasle. He did an awful lot of research and work, and he was able to tell me the names of the people that were in the some of them were in it, including a relation of his own. Yeah. Okay. So I mean, my grandmother prayed for all them every night. So it really wasn't immaterial to me, but that was the time, and who they were at the time. People were very volatile, and they got very worked up, and maybe they had a few drinks in them. I don't know what happened, but it was. We couldn't ever talk about them when we were growing up as kids. We asked our father. Dad was he was the youngest in the family, and he was very close to Barney. And
didn't want to hear about it.
We weren't allowed to talk about it. And one time in Dad's late years, he'd been in hospital, and I had gone down to take him out, or taking him home, and we were passing the gates of the chapel, and he said, "Stop." And he said that those gates are no longer in the chapel in Lermig Ward, it's all car park now. But the old gates in the chapel, he stopped, he said, and he said, the Sunday after Barney was buried, there was a notice put on that gate that I was the next to be shot. And he had to go from house to house for the next 9 months, even after the ceasefire, because there were people still threatening him. A young fellow, 15, went on for 16 years of age. So my grandmother had great difficulty in mourning her son and knowing that her youngest son could be shot, and my grandfather as well. So I can understand maybe now why they couldn't talk about stuff, and they certainly didn't want us to know about things that happened. So I had great difficulty, and when I went to do research on my Uncle Bernard, his whole army file was destroyed. There's no longer in existence. And even his army number, I could never get it. And he certainly was, if you think about how the British Army wanted to get him, how they took over it was Lanty O'Hanlon's, it was called in those days. It was the name Lanty O'Hanlon was made famous by Patrick McGill, the author. He wrote a book, and one of his main characters was this man called Lanty O'Hanlon. But Lanty O'Hanlon had the post office, and he had before that he had the post office. He had a shop, and he had a bar, and he was the biggest farmer around and all that. And they took over his premises, and they sat there trying to capture my Uncle Barney. they didn't get him, but they almost got him a few times, but he got away. But that gives you how important he was to them to get him.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry, John.
It was it was fascinating. It was strange times. It was a brutal times.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and then the Civil War added a whole new dimension to events. But thanks to documentaries like these, they're not forgotten, and stories like yours. And there's another Donegal connection tonight as well, like Kieran Glennon, who's actually from Dublin, but he's chatting about his grandfather Tom Glennon.
I read his book, yeah.
Yeah, who was a member of the Free State Army.
Yeah.
And he was actually assigned to Donegal, and he's chatting about an incident.
I think he was there to come to Joseph Sweeney, I think, for most of his time in Donegal.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
He's from Belfast, I believe.
Well, that story features as well tonight. You obviously, care a lot about this period in history, as you rightly care about your uncle and your uncle's memory. So you've done a lot of work.
Yeah. I think the fact that none of us knew anything about it, and that our children they were very curious. They didn't know what happened either. And I think about 10 or 11 years ago, I had an opportunity with T.T. Cahart to do a documentary called Bray Hugus Bass. And that was based on my uncle Bernard, and it was about from birth to death, and that was the first time that was kind of talked about, and a lot of people all over Ireland that time were able to relate to this silence, and that it was great to hear this type of story for the first time. And that's the history you're talking about. Yeah,
it's too bad that 100 years on, if we couldn't talk about these events now in an open way. But the series starts tonight. It's called The Silent Civil War, and Brian, your story about Barney features tonight. It's after the 9 o'clock news on RTE1. Brian, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Reverend Jim Lamont presents an evening of music and song.